I would now like to introduce today's presenters. Amy Fong is the partner leading Everest Group's sourcing and vendor management practice. In this role, she advises enterprises on maximizing value from strategic provider relationships in global services categories. Banushi Malhotra is a practice director in Everest Group's sourcing and vendor management practice. She advises clients on maximizing value through their supply base engagements to obtain cost, business, and operational benefits. Pratik Singh is a practice director aligned with the business process services practice. Pratik's responsibilities include leading Everest Group's procurement and supply chain management, BPS membership offerings, along with providing clients with custom strategic advisory support. And with that, I'd like to turn things over to Amy.
Thank you. So we are going to kick off today with some discussion around what procurement and category management looks like in terms of aligning objectives and what the priorities of category managers typically are. And then we'll move into category management organization and some of the design factors to think about. We have been doing quite a bit of research, interviews, analysis on what we see in the leading companies right now, and wanted to use this webinar as an opportunity to share and discuss that. Category management's evolved quite a bit, but some of the fundamentals are still there. And then we'll talk about the design shifts and the trends that we see that are driving changes in existing structures, and a lot of change right now, so that's particularly interesting. So let's get into it. Procurement strategies are effective across a number of different areas to make the organization bring the most value to your stakeholders, right? And these are not new, these are really the fundamentals of procurement. But I think as category management has evolved over the last several years, and the procurement organization as a whole has taken a more strategic role, these have evolved and really elevated in the way that we work. So we start with process streamlining, and of course process streamlining can be as simple as having the right policy, having the right processes or procedures, but has evolved quite a bit as procurement has been automated. Most of the transactional should be automated using digital solutions now, and we see automation impacting even the more strategic, non-repeatable type of activities, which is a really interesting trend right now as we see what Gen AI could potentially do. And then, of course, bringing agile, small a agile more than large a agile, or capital A agile, methodologies into sourcing practices to quicken up the cycle times and reduce time, and also increase the alignment with stakeholders and meeting their needs. The next area is cost control, and obviously savings have been a big focus for procurement for a long time, but moving towards a total cost of ownership, a TCO approach, and even what I would consider is more demand management or shaping specifications, adjusting specifications to match the market, matching your portfolio with demand from your stakeholders. And then supplier rationalization, whether that be consolidation, specialization, various levers that you can pull around costs based on the supply-based structure. Of course, innovation, and this is one of the more mature factors and goals that organizations struggle with, but identifying opportunities to co-innovate with your suppliers and bring in joint development, joint partnerships. This may be product related, and it may be process related on the indirect side. And then finally, responsible procurement. Some areas like supplier diversity, at least in the US, have been around for decades, but the focus on responsible procurement has certainly evolved over the last couple of years, bringing in more mandates around sustainability and environmental factors, carbon neutrality, and broader DEI initiatives across the supplier workforce as well. So really interesting progress as a procurement overall objectives standpoint. When we look at what category management specifically means, and category management strategies and what sourcing leaders need to do, we want to see sourcing leaders taking a more systematic approach to formulating their procurement and category management strategies. And category management evolved a few years ago. Sorry, next slide, please. Category management evolved a few years, many years back, I would say in the last decade, from sourcing execution that was very event-based to a more strategic approach that looked at the market and the needs of the internal stakeholder and the organization and evolved to match business priorities. And starting with aligning to business objectives to the procurement priorities and vice versa. Then moving on to evaluating the supplier market, developing strategies, category management strategy, as well as a broader procurement strategy, creating action plans, and then monitoring and evaluating that. So when we look at category management strategies, they're more of an ongoing process between sourcing, the procurement function, and the stakeholders in the business and the supply base that continue to evolve as business evolves. Let me pause and see, Banushi, Pratik, any examples or thoughts and comments on this process and what we've seen as we've talked to companies about this?
Yeah, great insights, Amy. I think one thing that I wanted to add over here was around how different categories and their complexities also change this particular process a lot. And when I say that, I mean, if we take an example of, let's say, the IT category, and let's say it's a centralized structure, then IT is working directly with business. They're able to align directly with business, have meetings with them frequently, and the whole strategy just becomes a streamlined process in that case. I'm not saying it's easy for IT category managers, but it's relatively easy when the organizational structure or culture allows you to have that sort of synergy between IT and business. Whereas for something like, let's say, legal services, at least in our experience, we've seen it typically being handled within business only. So it's tougher for procurement to get a seat at the table when it comes to making a category strategy for legal services as well. And similarly, if you look at global versus regional category management structures, everything really defines how the category is being managed across different regions. So this is where the structure actually gets affected a lot when it comes to formulating the strategy.
Yeah, and now that we have covered the approaches towards designing effective procurement and category management strategies, I think it will be good to understand from our audience here as well with regards to what they believe are the top priorities for category managers in their respective organizations.
Mm-hmm. Touching the results in, and I think there's no surprises here.
Supplier risk management is slowly going up as well. But of course, cost reduction is still the key objective. Yeah.
Pratik, you want to wrap up or read it off?
Yeah, so not really surprising here to see spend cost reduction being a top priority for category managers, and especially during these current times wherein there's a lot of concern around impending recession and a lot of pressure on the procurement organization as well to drive further cost reductions. I think what's interesting to see is also the supplier relation risk management aspect of it. And I think this kind of accentuated since the pandemic experience, and it has continued to be a top priority for organizations from there on. Yeah.
Yeah, we can't seem to get that one off the #1 priority. Right? Move on to bigger and better things, but still important, of course, especially in these times.
Yeah. So just double clicking on what are some of the priorities for or key objectives for category managers. So if you move on to the next slide, you'll see that the #1 priority for category managers is around achieving some of their business objectives aligned to the broader organizational goals. And here also you would not find surprising that spend cost reduction and cost optimization are the key focus areas for category managers. And by spend reduction, it's not just about driving the least cost in terms of purchasing, but it revolves around the overall total cost of ownership and not looking at just the short-term perspective when it comes to your sourcing strategies. And again, featuring here would be the entire supplier relationship management aspect of things. And while we talked about the supplier risk management aspect of it, I think there's also an increased focus among organizations to better engage with their suppliers and co-innovate and identify synergies among their supplier base to achieve the common objectives, which are mutually beneficial for both the organization as well as the suppliers. Another interesting area where we've seen increased focus on is around while cost reduction and supplier relationship management are part of your ongoing responsibilities for category managers, we have seen increased focus on talent management with all the disruptions that we have seen over the last couple of years. Talent management continues to be a key priority. And with the broader businesses also double-clicking or doubling down on their ESG focus, we see that falling down into the procurement organization as well. And another aspect around procurement agility and the way that you engage with the business stakeholders and improving the overall experience continues to be another major focus area for category managers. Now looking at, so while category managers have had this mandate over the years, but we see category managers also leveraging some of the third-party providers or outsourcing providers when it comes to their overall managing their overall category strategies and seeking support on that front as well. So if we just move on to the next slide, you'll find that while category management and sourcing is one of the core procurement processes and a key strategic area for enterprises, we do not see it being outsourced to the full extent, with enterprises still largely preferring to have control over some of these strategic activities in-house. However, we do see them leveraging third-party providers in specific areas across the category strategy activities. And the primary ones that stand out are the overall spend analytics and the market intelligence capabilities. So while category managers have an internal view with regards to their spend, they do not have a view with regards to how the overall industry is moving and what are the kind of pricing strategies that different organizations are following. So market intelligence is a capability which we see a lot of service providers bring in as part of their overall offerings, and they bring with them along the experience of serving multiple clients and providing the necessary intelligence that is needed for category managers to execute on their strategies successfully. And spend analytics is also another interesting area. So procurement traditionally has been a laggard when it comes to digital adoption if we compare it to other horizontals like F&A and HR. So this is an area where we see a lot of organizations reaching out to third-party providers and asking them to, or seeking support in terms of analyzing their spend, categorizing it effectively, and identifying savings opportunities as well for the organization. So these are, I would say, some of the aspects where we see organizations leveraging third-party support. And even from a supply side as well, we see a lot of procurement outsourcing providers doubling down on their investments when it comes to developing some of the upstream procurement capabilities. And that has translated to increased willingness among enterprises as well to engage with providers in this space. Now,
exactly. Yeah. And I think, Prateek, just going back to the enterprise we were talking to this morning, right? So we were speaking to an enterprise and they were planning to outsource around 50% of their procurement. And coincidentally, this conversation was happening today itself. So they were planning to, cut short their procurement department resources to around 50% and also outsource a lot of their B2B component. So those transactional activities that you see on the right side of the slide, those part was, that enterprise at least was planning to outsource most parts of it. And so interesting example, right? And we've seen multiple other cases of organizations who want to seek support and how much to outsource, how much they shouldn't, which providers they should go to, and also a little bit about how they should design their own retained organization post outsourcing, right? So there's a certain management that you need to do with the procurement outsourcing provider in that case.
Yeah, good that you bring that up, Banushi. So just wanted to say that this is not just a one-off requirement. We have recently seen quite an uptick in similar requests, and especially on the procurement side. So yeah, that kind of indicates that there's a broader trend around increased willingness among enterprises to seek support in this space. Yeah. And I think this kind of leads us into our next segue. And in fact, this was also one of the questions that we received prior to the webinar, which was around the overall category management organization design principles. So Banushi, why don't you cover this?
Sure. So basically in this section, we'll sort of go through all the design factors that lead to the structure of an organization, right? So give you an overview of what type of structures are prevalent in the market, but also try to give you an overview of what are the factors that are helping design it, and what are the roles and responsibilities that are currently there, skills, capabilities within the category management audience. So if we move right into the section, we're going to get started with firstly looking at a current structure and what it can look like. So this is just a directional perspective. You see the left part of the slide, how the reporting lines of procurement and category management are typically in a large organization. And I'm sure most of you are procurement veterans here, so you would already be aware of this. But just to sort of put things here in perspective, this overall reporting line of the CPO, it can be to the CFO or the CEO, depending on the organization. And the indirect procurement, direct procurement, all report up to the CPO, right? But so these are all the things that you would probably be aware of. But the different aspects that we've observed, and that depends a lot on organization structures, is how the category management reporting is different from a global as well as a regional perspective. So for certain categories, there would be, let's say, regional category managers who would be reporting up to a global head of indirect procurement, or even to a global category management organization in some cases. However, in some cases where the category can be managed from one area on a global level, there would only be, category managers reporting to a global category head in that case. So it differs a lot on the organization, and also it differs a lot on the spend that is being managed and from where it is being managed. So for instance, we were speaking to an organization recently, leading oil and gas major. And in their case, it was sort of like a center-led structure, which means that different regions had different center heads for procurement. So in that case, they had to manage the reporting line at a regional level, and there were multiple regional category heads who were actually rolling up to the head of indirect procurement, right? So this is one type of case. And of course, in multiple other cases, a lot of regional heads or all the global spend is actually rolling up to your one single category manager. So I would say, it depends on your organization, whether you have a centralized procurement, center-led procurement, or decentralized procurement. It doesn't really matter in terms of the execution of activities, as long as it's best fit for your organization, right? So there's no one model is better than the other over here. It's just what works for you and your firm, right? So if we move now to the next slide, we'll actually be able to understand how sourcing execs, now we spoke a little bit about category managers, right? So when we look at the structure of category management, even under category managers, there are sourcing executives, procurement specialists, and different teams that also enable this particular function, right? But when we look at the sourcing exec function as a whole, this is one role that really enables category managers, because from the name itself, they work a lot in collaboration with category managers to execute sourcing activities, right? So all the aspects related to, the running complex RFPs, doing the negotiations, this is typically managed by the sourcing exec, who is also, if you think in terms of seniority, this particular person or multiple sourcing executives in a lot of cases, they have a lot of professional experience in managing complex negotiations, managing large complex categories, and so on and so forth, right? So let's say if your category manager is managing $800 million of spend, your sourcing execs will be managing 200 million, and so on and so forth. And of course, that depends a lot on the size of an organization. But this is just an example from what an organization was doing that we were talking to, right? So strategic sourcing activities are the key, mandate for a sourcing executive. And they're usually engaged in complex deals, and they work directly with business and category managers to drive initiatives. Now, if we move to the next slide, what we'll see over here is a typical category management organization and how it is structured, right? So as we mentioned earlier, the CPO is right on top. There's a global category head and multiple category managers. And then we're talking about the sourcing execs. And there are two other roles that are mentioned over here, category analysts as well as procurement specialists, right? So when we look at these two particular roles, these are all, they can be individual contributors within the organization that help multiple category managers, or in some cases, they can be rolling up to a single category manager as well, right? So it really depends on the type of organization. But if we just have to talk about the role of a category analyst and a procurement specialist, typically category analysts are market intel folks. They would, provide the market trends, support sourcing execs in all the day-to-day supplier information gathering activities, and so on and so forth. And the procurement specialists also support sourcing execs and category managers in complex negotiations and, making sure that the deal starts and reaches an end stage. So having explained this structure, there are also, of course, multiple supporting teams that these folks work with, right? Starting from your legal for the contract management process, finance, of course. I think somebody asked a question about savings and having it approved with budget and all of those things. So there's a certain level of reporting that procurement always needs to do with finance. And that is when the collaboration of the sourcing executive comes into play with the finance department. And of course, there's P2P as well for the requisitioning and all of those aspects. Another interesting thing that was also coming into play over here was the horizontal teams that are supporting, right? So some of these are fairly, prevalent: vendor management, making sure that post-sourcing, there's a certain supplier management process in place. But there's also a very, good advent of DE and I teams. So those diversity champions, making sure your ESG initiatives are being followed. These type of teams are also becoming larger and larger. And in fact, there is a good amount of mandate in terms of increasing the percentage of spend that you have with your diverse providers. And setting the diversity roadmap is the key objective of this particular D&I team within procurement. Right. So I think if we can move to the next particular page, we will see an example, and this is very similar to the last page, so I won't get too deep into it. But we wanted to share this example because it was, a structure that we spoke, like Amy mentioned, we did a lot of interviews, right? So this was a special case that we wanted to put out here from a Fortune 500 financial services organization. So the way they had structured that category management organization was that there were two global heads of IT. One of them was managing the US-based spend, and the other one was managing the non-US-based spend, right? Because the US-based spend was around 800 million, and the other part of it was around 100 million. So while the US-based spend was particularly, well managed, I would say that there were specific category heads for, software category, infrastructure, and so on and so forth. There was a sort of a straight line reporting into these category managers as well. On the other side of the regional spend, which is a non-US based spend, there were multiple regional category heads, and it was actually more fragmented for the $100 million of spend than it was for the $800 million of spend, right? So in fact, with this particular organization, the challenge that they were also facing was that the regional category managers were managing a lot of activities, and they were really busy on a day-to-day basis, right? From a resource management perspective for the global need. Whereas some of the category managers on this side of the table, since the processes were more streamlined, they were actually, not as busy in that case, even though they were managing larger amounts of spend. So even that resource allocation and management was becoming a bigger challenge for the lead, who was the head of procurement in this particular case. So very interesting example that we saw over here, and the different types of challenges that organizations face with structures. Okay, we can move to the next particular page, right? Amy, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, so let's jump into another question for the audience. We'd like to understand what factors have influenced your decision in terms of organizational structure. So which of these factors kind of drove you to a centralized or decentralized or center-led or other kinds of category management, related factors into creating your structure? And please you can select as many as apply, spend visibility and volume, nature of supplier relationships, required functional expertise, meaning categories that need a special expertise that is on the team, or global versus regional versus localization of a category. There are certainly some categories that we see are very specific to a country or to a region. So the needs vary quite a bit globally. And we'll give this just another probably 10 seconds. I see many of you have participated. All right, it seems to be leveling out. So I think we can end that. We've got more than half. Interesting. So spend visibility and volume was the largest. And I would say that's not atypical. The size of the spend means, comes down to the size of the contracts and often the complexity of the contracts, and that often or in the relationships as well, and that often drives the amount of work that a category manager is given. But really interesting, I think, to see that the other three came pretty close, and almost half of you said it's also nature of supplier relationships, functional expertise, and global representation or regional representation. So very interesting factors there. Let me show you a little bit more about what we've seen across other organizations on the next slide. And that's that we've seen all four of these really affect different companies and the way that they structure. Again, I think spend visibility and volume is sort of the default. That's kind of been the traditional way of saying, I think when I used to do benchmarking of FTEs and procurement, it was often, okay, we have 10 billion in spend divided by X number of FTEs. And there's a sort of an assumption that you can divide it evenly and it's like peanut butter that smooths evenly across. I think that's a false assumption. Both spend covered as well as savings expected. There's a lot of other factors that fit into this. And I would say beyond, just the three mentioned here, the other three, the amount that the category has been addressed in the past. If it's something that's been sourced a million times and you already have preferred suppliers, it's going to take a little less effort. It's more in a business as usual, manage, run mode, and you're looking for new opportunities for efficiencies or partnerships. That's going to be a little bit different than something that's never really been covered, is an emerging technology, requires new suppliers, has lots of complications, needs rationalization, et cetera. But the factors around specialized skills and global coverage or geographic coverage and relationships definitely play in. We see, projects below 100K, that's typically, a tactical sourcing team. Category managers, are generally kind of assigned to their category with stakeholder knowledge and category knowledge. I think this has been a bit of a back and forth through what I've seen. There's a debate that, category managers have a set of leverageable skills that can be applied across categories, and others would say that category managers can need to have deep expertise, and you see people coming in with 20 years of experience in, say, a very specialized pharma category or something. That tends to happen more on the direct side, but even in indirect areas like contingent workforce, where people sort of stick to their category through their career. Neither one is necessarily better or worse, but I think that it's good to look at a mix of those, and certainly having more flexibility gives more opportunity to find people, availability for talent in a talent constrained period, which we've had in the last couple of years. It also gives more opportunity to more junior people to move up. So versus prioritizing those with 10 years of experience in a specific category. So that's something to think about here. As well as moving, which categories really need that geographic focus and which could be moved to a more, regional, local to regional, and then regional to a global strategy. That's certainly something that, I think as sourcing organizations evolve needs to be addressed as well. And some things are just entirely local or regional. Others, with time can be brought to a global provider, or a handful of global suppliers. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Pratik. Can you talk a little bit about the role of category managers that you've seen?
Thanks, Amy. Yeah. So I think now that we have understood the design principles, it's also important to understand the category managers' primary roles as well as some of the added responsibilities that they have. So in a sense, category managers have the complete ownership of their respective categories, right from developing and designing the category strategies and executing on them, ensuring compliance with the overall procurement policies and regulations, tracking the performance of their initiatives, or based on some of the metrics that they have outlined themselves for themselves as part of the category management strategies. And they've also a crucial role to play when it comes to actual negotiation of contracts and terms with suppliers, and monitoring and reporting on the supplier performance as well. I think what's not very well documented, or often not very well understood, is around their secondary responsibilities. And that would involve the collaboration with internal and external stakeholders, understanding the business requirements, and then reaching out to the respective suppliers which can fulfill those requirements. Similarly, it's also about upskilling their teams. So while they have their own role defined, they have a lot of people working under them. And with the changing times, the overall skills also need to evolve. Skills would be more in line with either the evolution of the category in itself, and also leveraging some of the digital tools and technologies that are coming up in the market as well. Now that we have discovered the key role of the category managers, I think it's also important to understand what are the top 5 skills that are needed to be a successful category manager. Now, here you would see that there's a lot of emphasis on some of the secondary roles that we discussed in the previous slides, with stakeholder management coming out to be one of the most important factors. And again, with increased focus on overall stakeholder satisfaction, both internal and external, this remains a key focus area, or a key area that, or a key skill that a category manager should have in order to be effective in his role. Market intelligence is also another interesting aspect. So while you may have a view of what's happening within your organization, it's always, it's important to also understand what's happening out there in the market, whether it be in terms of the overall pricing movements, incorporating some of the best practices as part of your processes or category strategies. And obviously with cost reduction being a key priority and a key focus area for category managers, it's not surprising to see commercial acumen also featuring high in terms of the top 5 skills that are required for category managers. Another interesting point that I would want to highlight here. So while you would see digital skills being relatively lower in terms of the ranking that you would see here, but this is increasingly becoming an important criteria for organizations when it comes to developing their category managers. And in fact, in one of our recent studies, we observed that this came out as one of the top skill gaps that organizations have within their sourcing operations. And with all the buzz around generative AI and increased focus on leveraging some of the digital levers around automation, analytics, this skill would is expected to become more important for category managers in order to be successful at their jobs. Now, with that, I'll hand it back to Amy and to cover how the overall design principles are changing given the overall economic scenario, as well as some of the trends that we are seeing in the market.
Thanks, Prateek. So basically in this section, yeah, go ahead, Amy.
No, it's all right. I was going to let you take this one. Go ahead.
Yeah, great. So basically in this last particular section, we wanted to talk a little bit about what are the design shifts when it comes to procurement and category management structures. And this will be sort of driven by the changes or the key themes that we are seeing within procurement in the market, right? So if you are in the procurement world, you've already heard of all these themes, right? All the emerging technologies that are coming up, the macroeconomic uncertainties that are going on, as well as some of the mandates around ESG. So let's get right into the section and try to observe what's happening to our structures. The first thing that we wanted to sort of, and this is the base setting slide, right? That how often is it that structures are even revised on the basis of changes in, let's say, additions to, the sourcing landscape, new technologies that are coming in, and so on and so forth. So what we have observed in the market is that typically and this is the best of the best organizations that we've surveyed, right? So the best-in-class organizations review their category structures periodically and on an ad hoc basis when new sourcing needs emerge, right? So if, let's say, there is a new technology that is coming up, maybe it's generative AI, and it has reached the transformational stage, best-in-class organizations would review whether they should be changing their sourcing strategies and category structures on the basis of that, right? So if we just look at the overall changes, some of the factors that are driving it would be, of course, all the trends that are happening, but also the changes that are happening within the internal organization. So if, let's say, there's some restructuring, moving from central-led to centralized structures or vice versa, right? First, there would be a realignment of the structures as well. So not only just the market side, there's also an internal perspective when it comes to the changes or the reviews in category structures. One more thing that is interesting to note is that during this review process, category managers typically, or I would say even heads of indirect procurement, they would typically look at all activities within the category before they make a decision to create new categories or new sourcing strategies. And that involves aspects such as, thinking about whether they should consolidate some spend across categories, think more around the preferred supplier model, or just the overall portfolio as a whole. Because that is when you're able to make the, sort of holistic or informed decisions about actually reviewing your category structures in an efficient manner. So this slide just gives an overview of, the typical indirect services spend structures that we have seen across companies. But of course, it may differ based on what your business needs are versus what is not there. So having said this into context, now let's start looking at some of the trends that are coming in and how the structures are changing according to these trends, right? So we've actually tried to just keep this down to, 3 trends over here. The first one being ESG. We've been talking a lot about ESG, and I was actually waiting for the poll results to come in to see how many of you are also interested in, treating ESG as a key priority. And I think the number was around, the range of 30 to 40% only. But it is actually something that we are hearing a lot about, that there are more and more, there's more and more focus being put from business to procurement on increasing the ESG element within procurement. Whether it is talking about sourcing more from diverse suppliers, looking at, the carbon neutrality or the carbon net zero sort of promises made by your service providers, or anything related to how much the service providers that you're working with are even reporting their ESG impact on the environment. So when it comes to procurement, just ensuring that your suppliers are actually following this sort of compliance framework that your organization is putting together is actually becoming more and more important. I wouldn't say that it's a deal breaker right now, that if you have one supplier that is not doing so well in service delivery but great in ESG, it's not like you would select them ever, right? But there is certainly more focus being put on the ESG component. So you organizations, sourcing teams are looking more and more for these type of providers who are following these norms better, right? So if you think about the factors that are driving shifts in these design, category structure design now, the reporting and compliance component has of course increased. And because of this, you need a specialized team, or you need some resources within your category management organization to be able to track these things, right? Because providers can send you all the data that you may need, but how to actually track and measure this data, that is something that only ESG focused personnel within procurement teams will be able to do effectively, right? So that's the overall impact we see for ESG on the category structure. Prateek, what do you think about this? Do you think you have also seen, similar impact on ESG within procurement?
Yes, definitely, Bhanushi. So in fact, we did a survey last year, and there we saw that there was a 30% increase in enterprise investments when it came to ESG, and around 50% and 56% more inclusion of some ESG related components as part of outsourcing engagements. And when it comes to procurement, I think procurement sits or has a very unique position within an organization, right? So while it manages the internal stakeholder requirements and facilitates its fulfillment, it also coordinates with suppliers, which constitute a major chunk of an organization's ESG footprint. So increasingly, we have seen a lot more focus on the ESG front from the procurement standpoint. So while the current focus is more around the compliance and reporting aspect of it, we see, at least in some of the mature organizations, they're slowly moving towards incorporating sustainability principles as part of their overall category management strategies. And even in RFPs, we have started seeing inclusion of more ESG related aspects or dimensions across the enterprises. So while these are not decision-making factors as such, but they have become at least a consideration criteria when it comes to supplier evaluation and identification.
Yeah, definitely. In fact, I think Prateek's team just recently launched a research on ESG and procurement, and very interesting findings within that. Yeah. A lot of research going on within our firm on ESG as well. Impact sourcing, sustainability, ESG. We're building a lot on this particular area. Okay.
Yeah, and
So
even
now
the
next
service providers, sorry, just one
Go
more
ahead.
point to add, Vanashi. Yeah. So even from a service provider perspective, we see the outsourcing service providers are also very bullish in space. And over the last 2 years, we have seen a significant ramp up in their investments as well. So while the demand is still in a very nascent stage, I would say, but service providers are already prepping in terms of developing capabilities and being able to serve some of this demand, which they do expect to come in the coming years.
Definitely. So it's much beyond the buzzword that people sometimes predict it to be, right? It's become a part of their major value propositions as well as their offerings, apart going beyond the marketing around it. Yeah, great. So I think the next trend that we wanted to capture was emerging technologies. And this is also something that we have been really focusing upon within the firm. So, or actually everyone has been focusing upon this, generative AI, metaverse, all of these are really, hot trends that just take the market by a storm. And it's very interesting to see how these technologies sort of go up the transformational journey. Some of them plateau, some of them decline. And basis that the sourcing strategies or category management structures also shift themselves to adjust to the new advent of technologies, right? So even if we think intuitively, when new technologies are added to the table, typically these are sourced along with existing sort of categories. So maybe somebody in digital would be managing generative AI, or it would be across the board, right? Maybe a marketing would be managing generative AI for marketing. And similarly, IT category manager would be managing Gen AI for IT, so on and so forth. But at some point, these technologies become so big that they need a separate category of their own, right? So the process becomes very different in that case, because you need experts who are actually aware of the supplier base, the supplier market overview within this particular category. And you need those category managers to be managing spend as is, right? So I think in that case, what usually ends up happening is that there's a lot of learning and development for sourcing personnel. And there's a lot of skills that are added to the table when it comes to sourcing emerging technologies. So restructuring of teams and introduction of new tech always brings forward new, structural changes within an organization, but it remains to be seen when a technology has actually reached the stage where there is a restructuring that's required, right? In the beginning, there's a certain adaptation that goes on. Sorry, can we move to the previous slide? I just jumped a little bit right. So I think the third point that we wanted to discuss over here was the macroeconomic uncertainty aspect. So this is around, all the geopolitical turmoil, recessionary trends that are going on. What it brings to the table in terms of structural changes is more focus on, contingency planning and supply chain visibility, and also more focus on making sure that there is a certain level of risk mitigation within categories, right? So there are mostly on-the-go alterations to structures when service delivery disruptions are there, or when inflationary issues are there. And there is also an increased emphasis on risk management within the category planning process. Great. So now I think we wanted to just give an example of emerging tech, and I explained this in the previous slides as well a little bit. But if we move to the next slide, there is a certain cycle that we see with emerging tech, and this is just an example that we showed that when technology is introduced and it goes up the value chain, there's some technologies that become transformational, some of them that plateau, and some of them that decline. And basis that, if we move to the next page, you'll see how the sourcing strategies are also changing accordingly, right? So for declining technologies, of course, there are no changes in the sourcing strategy. Whereas for technologies that are transformational, there may be a new creation of category and new sourcing models as well. Right. So with that, I think that brings us, to our CTA, which is our call to action. Amy, do you want to share a little bit around what our today's offer is?
Yes, so on the next slide and in the chat, we have a link that you can click. What we'd like to offer to the sourcing teams on the phone, so this is, or on the call, this is specifically to the buy side attendees, is access to one of our category strategy templates. And we've been working on these templates over the last several years now. We have about probably 15 of them that are listed here. There's a couple of others as well in process. And these aggregate a lot of the research, the deep research we have in these categories across Everest Group. What we wanted to do was look at all of the research that our service line analysts create and aggregate that into a template, a format that works for category managers. And so these are PowerPoint templates that you're able to drop into your own corporate slide format and cover, both the buy side and the sell side, or the market side information, buyer intelligence and market intelligence, I should say, information that you need to cover any of these categories. Again, these are mainly complex services categories. That's what Everest Group's historically focused on, although we continue to evolve into more next-gen technology as well. So please click this link. You can click it here or in the email that follows that follows the webinar to request this, and we'll share one of these templates with you and hope that they're valuable. Something that our members of our research programs have found very useful. And so with that, I think we'll jump into kind of a wrap-up slide, just talking about some of the benefits and the concerns around the category structures that we've talked about. I think there's a number of different benefits that we see here, and that's why this idea of category management has stuck around for a while. Cost-effective procurement, bringing more in-depth expertise, streamlining so that you have a team kind of focused on a specific category that can focus on efficiencies and customize their strategies, as well as bringing more information to the decision-making process. So having a team that's supporting a category brings additional skills to that. I think there's a number of concerns here, around being too rigid and potentially silos. It's really important to make sure that you're evolving, and we just showed some emerging categories, emerging technologies. It's important that you're evolving as market conditions change, as your own spend changes, as your internal allocation of priorities and resources changes, and also making sure that there's not multiple teams overlapping here. And I would say that another one that we haven't really put on paper, but one of the challenges going back to those templates is that it's historically been a fairly manual process of building out these category strategies. And I don't think all teams have been completely effective at doing that. We're starting to see some technologies come in. I think there's some really interesting stuff with Gen AI that's helping to, create dashboards and aggregate market information into category strategies, and we should keep an eye on that and leverage those abilities or those technologies to overcome some of these concerns. But certainly something that we need to be cautious. Putting a category strategy or category organization together and leaving it for 10 years is not the right answer either. We need to be really agile in how we design organizations. So with that, I want to let's jump onto Q&A and see if there's any examples any questions that we want to address for the team. And I admit I've been answering some of these in writing as we've gone, but we can certainly jump back to any of them. I think a good one here that I want to make sure we get to is examples of implementing sustainability practices in sourcing. And Pratik, I'm gonna ask you that one because I think you're one of our ESG fellows, right? Or you have been in the past and have some experience in this and done some research. Thoughts on that?
Thanks, Amy. Yeah, I can take this up. So yeah, we do see incorporation of sustainability practices across the entire value chain when it comes to sourcing. So it starts right from building a roadmap for carbon management, circularity, net zero targets. When it comes to spend analytics and insights, it's about not just monitoring your direct spend, but also looking at some of your scope 3 emissions, implementing closed loop spend management to drive better value through your ESG initiatives. From a supplier relationship management aspect, diversity still remains a key criteria. From a category management and sourcing perspective, identifying your high emission subcategories and assessing your supplier base across those. Those are, I would say, some of the examples that we typically see, which are starting to get incorporated across the procurement value chain. But yeah, Bhanushi, Amy, anything else that you would want to add on top of that?
Good answer.
Covered it off pretty well, Pratik. I mean, one thing that we have also been working on as a team is on the social aspect of ESG, right? So more around supplier diversity, making sure that the suppliers you're working with have, you're helping the diverse communities, more impact sourcing initiatives, which basically means that you're working with suppliers that are actually getting workforce from underdeveloped or underprivileged areas and helping them grow as well. So we've seen multiple examples of these type of activities. And in some cases, we've also seen that organizations help these smaller suppliers actually ramp up their capabilities by making them partner with the larger suppliers, right? So this is a case of actual impact that you're creating in terms of, helping suppliers grow, becoming more capable and gaining more scale as well.
Thanks, Manushi. Another question that I kind of answered with my experience, but I'd like to hear yours since you did some of the research more directly recently. What about reporting into the COO or reporting into other C-level executives? How much did we see that?
Yeah, I think it depends on the. I think I've seen that in cases of direct spend, when there was more of product related activities within the organization. There was direct reporting to the COO organization in that case. But whenever, and even with let's say retail CPG firms, I've seen instances of direct reporting to COOs instead of CFOs or CEOs directly. But when it comes to, let's say, the BFSI segment, or any sort of services, healthcare services, I have not seen instances of too much reporting to the COO.
Yeah, I tend to see that more in direct, product type companies versus services companies.
Yeah.
I do see a question about direct category templates. So Everest Group is really focused on indirect spend. We don't cover really direct categories, so that's not something we have. Our focus is global services as well as next gen technology. So that's really where you'll see our, the majority of our research as well as our category templates. Here's an interesting one. Is category management possible when there's no centralization of procurement?
Well, I can take a stab at it, but I would like you to add from your experience, Amy. So I think category management is possible, of course, right? And we sort of talked about this in our presentation today. When it comes to center-led structures or regional structures in terms of category managers, you would have regional category heads and that type of audience, managing categories on different levels. What we've also seen now, centralized and center-led is covered, right? Yes, we have seen evidence of category management in both of these type of structures, though of course it's a little more fragmented than the centralized one. But when it comes to decentralized organizations, we have seen instances of business having category managers sort of embedded within their function, and there is direct coordination between category managers with business stakeholders, and the reporting also goes up into the business unit only. So it's not like in that case the category management function is weak or anything like that, but it's just that the reporting sort of falls into the business organization. And sometimes in those cases, there is sort of a procurement COE, which is managing the market intelligence related aspects when it comes to category management. Yeah. Anything you wanted to add from your experience, Amy, to that?
No, I mean, I think you covered it well. I've definitely seen decentralized organizations that have some level of category management. And I think, again, we start to think of like decentralized as bad and centralized as good. And I actually think center-led is probably the balance of companies at this point. But, decentralized could just mean that business units are so different that they have their own category managers within that business unit or within that region. And that's certainly still can be a very effective category management, especially when you're on the direct side or, business specific services, things like that. So I know we're just at the end of the hour and I want to make sure we end on time. So I think we'll wrap it up. Our emails are here for questions or follow-up. You certainly have that link to request a template. We will be distributing the recording and the slides from this to anyone who attended. And if you're interested in talking further, please feel free to reach out to any of the three of us. Thank you so much for attending today and for giving us your time and all the great questions as well. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.